The Supreme Court will be seen to have played a big role in the destruction of democracy in the country. The role of the last 4 Chief Justices would be underlined, which openly discriminated against Muslims. This issue will really be decided in the next 2024 elections. Political parties must come under RTI, Citizenship Amendment Act, which was totally unconstitutional. So yes, UAPA is not only draconian, in my view, many provisions in that are unconstitutional. But unfortunately, this government has declared a war, ultimately paid through funds which are controlled by either Fauci or Bill Gates. I can't apologize for something which I believe to be true.
Welcome to Keraleeyam Talk. Today we have Advocate Prashanth Bhushan, who has been waging his long battle against undemocratic practices of Indian state, and today he came to Kerala to extend his support to the fight against Keraleeyam project, Silver Line project, which is described as the most destructive project which the Kerala state has ever seen. Welcome, Prashanth ji.
Thank you.
We know that you came to Kerala to take part in a similar agitation which was held in Calicut district some months ago. And when you come today, the situation has changed. Today you can find throughout Kerala, in different parts of districts, people are coming forward and fighting against the project. And on other hand, the state, Kerala state, is moving forward aggressively. They started land acquisition and causes a lot of conflict between the state authorities and the police. And even many people, the public perception is the most destructive project in Kerala that we have seen, and it is not at all suitable for a state like Kerala. But the Kerala state is very keen to take this project forward, and they have not discussed at all about what the people talk about it. So what do you think? What could be the real motive and intention of the state to move forward with such a destructive project?
Yes, you see, the reason why I have come here again to talk about this project is because I feel that it will bring ecological, social as well as financial ruin to Kerala. And that is quite obvious, and there are much better alternatives to this project. You, as Mr. Alok Verma, former chief engineer of the railways, who is probably the country's leading expert on such high-speed railway lines as well as lines through mountain regions, he's been saying that if you just upgrade the existing railway line, you can run trains at up to 150 kilometers an hour, which will be 50% higher speed than the present speed of trains in Kerala, and you can retain the same line, the same stations, etc., and that will be done at 1/10 the cost of this K-rail, which is a separate standalone line which will cause enormous ecological damage to the fragile ecology and the mountains and rivers of Kerala. And it's a line which is being built on standard gauge, which cannot be integrated to the rest of the railways, which will be a standalone line and at a cost of 1 lakh crores, which will be unviable, financially unviable. It will be a financial albatross around the neck of Kerala. So I don't understand why this government is so keen to push this project, despite the fact that Mr. Sridharan has pointed out that it's a totally ruinous project. Right. It is being undertaken without proper surveys and studies and understanding, etc. The only reason that I can think of is that, you see, when such projects are made, and there will be new stations coming up on this line, which will be far away from the existing stations, right, away from the towns also. So the real estate mafia feels that there is an opportunity to make a killing by purchasing land in that area where the stations are expected to come up, and then selling that land at a huge profit. This has happened in Amravati also, the new capital of Andhra. It has happened in the Ram temple in Ayodhya also. So this is a familiar game, and this is one of the reasons that I can think of, that it is being influenced by that real estate mafia. The second reason that I can think of is that when you have such an expensive project of 1 lakh crores and you will be giving contracts of 1 lakh crores for constructing the line, for buying the wagons and the engines and so on, which will all have to be imported, then there is a big opportunity for getting kickbacks. And that's a lure that many people have, that here is a big opportunity to get big kickbacks. And therefore, that could be another reason why the government is so keen. Because otherwise, if the government were to really think of the costs and benefits, it doesn't make any sense.
Don't you think, we know that Kerala state is ruled by left political organization, CPIM, led by CPIM. And when our country is moving forward towards left ideology, we always have hope in left political parties, right? So do you think that it's so unfortunate that even the left organizations are caught in nexus with the what do you say, people who make money out of it, right? And many people have say that what happened in Nandigram is going to happen in Kerala also. So what do you think about it? Why the left political parties cannot have a different stance on this kind of issues?
See, unfortunately, the left political party, or specifically the CPM, is no longer what it used to be, say, 50 years ago. And that is why it had its political demise in West Bengal. And if they continue in the same way in Kerala also, till Mr. Achyutanandan was the CM, I think to a large extent it was still following somewhat left policies, left ideology, left politics, etc. But now in the present government, I find that most of those things have been abandoned, and they are also proceeding in the same way, which is the path to political irrelevance in the long run, just as it happened in West Bengal.
Prashanth, your refusal to apologize the contempt of court following a Twitter reference to Supreme Court Judge Justice S.A. Bogde was one of the most controversial issue in India. So it was not a simple reference against one Chief Justice. You are just talking about the corruption and how the court, Supreme Court, which is a symbol of democratic practice, how it is supposed to protect the interest of people, was moving away from that. So what is, when you think about that issue today, so what do you think, what is the impact of that matter, and how the status of process of judicial reforms could taken forward?
So I had done 2 tweets on the basis of which I was charged for contempt. One was about Justice Bogde riding a 50 lakh motorcycle without a mask at a time when the Supreme Court was in lockdown virtually, and which was leading to denial of justice to millions of people who were waiting for their cases to be heard in the Supreme Court. The other was a tweet where I said that when the history of the Supreme Court is written, and the history of the destruction of democracy in this country, and the loss of independence of the judiciary, the last 4 Chief Justices or the Supreme Court will be seen to have played a big role in the destruction of democracy in the country, and in particular the role of the last 4 Chief Justices would be underlined. Now one could really see that during the tenure of the last 4 Chief Justices, which included Justice Bogde and 3 others preceding him, it had become clear that the court had ceased to be independent. And it was, in all important cases, it was just towing the government line, whether it was the Judge Loya case or the Ayodhya case or the so many cases, or the Birla Sahara case, etc. So I said what I believed to be true, and therefore when they were trying to force me to apologize, I said I can't apologize for something which I believe to be true. Where is the question of my apologizing for saying something which I believe to be true? So the impact of this case, firstly, was that it kind of laid bare before the whole country and perhaps before the whole world as to what the Supreme Court and the last role of the last 4 Chief Justices had been, and how the independence of the judiciary had collapsed. So the whole world could see that. And in that way, perhaps it also became at least some impetus towards judicial reforms. Of course, many kinds of judicial reforms are required, but this issue was about the loss of independence of the Supreme Court and the role of the Chief Justices in that loss of independence. So, to some extent, it highlighted the problem of this master of roster and how destructive this system of one man, the Chief Justice, being the master of roster and deciding which cases will be listed before which benches, and also about how independence of the judiciary and how independence of the judges is compromised these days by lure of post-retirement jobs, sometimes by blackmail, etc.
The anti-NRC, anti-CAA movement was something giving hope for all secular forces in India, and we know that it come to an abrupt end followed by COVID pandemic and followed by Delhi riot. You stood firm against the BJP-led government, and when you think about this movement now, what's the scope of secular forces in India now, and especially in the context when RSS has decided by 2025 they have to make India a majoritarian nation or a Hindu nation, because when they complete 100 years of RSS formation. So what's the scope of secularism or secular forces in India in this context now?
So the anti-CAA movement came up against the first discriminatory law that was passed. Of course, Muslims were being victimized in this country, were being badgered in this country on the streets by demonizing in the media, on the social media, etc. But this was the first time that the law had been brought which openly discriminated against Muslims. And that is why this led to this very big movement, which was primarily led by Muslim women. This was one unique characteristic of this movement, that it was primarily led by Muslim women. And it was a very peaceful, very exemplary movement in which the constitution was being taught to people and the constitutional values were being taught to people. And as you said, that after that the riots were engineered by this BJP people, Kapil Mishra, etc., and abetted by the Delhi police itself, and thereafter COVID came, so the movement kind of came to an end. But it still had an important impact, because till today the NRC CAA has not been implemented, and therefore in that respect it succeeded. It succeeded in stopping the implementation of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was totally unconstitutional. So you are right that there is a huge assault on secularism, and there is a huge onslaught of communal fascism going on in this country. And to that end, all institutions have been emasculated in order to prevent institutions from intervening, whether it is the judiciary or the election commission, etc., in this emasculation of secularism in this country. But I think there is still a very strong fight back going on by civil society, by even sections of the alternate media, by activists, by academics, etc. So therefore, I feel that this issue will really be decided in the next 2024 elections, and I expect that the BJP, because people have now seen through what they are doing, because this government has failed on all fronts, and all that it is doing is to incite communal hatred, fan communal riots, etc. People have seen through all that, and I think this time the people will be much wiser in their voting.
Sudha Bharadwaj was released on bail after serving a long-term imprisonment in Bhima Koregaon case. And we know that several activist teachers are still in jail. And UAPA is being implemented in the same manner even in Kerala, which is ruled by a left government. And what do you think? What's the possibility of fighting against such draconian laws in Indian context now?
So yes, UAPA is not only draconian. In my view, many provisions in that are unconstitutional. Firstly, the very wide definition given to unlawful activity, which says that any promoting of disaffection against the state is an unlawful activity. An unlawful activity is treated like terrorist activity. So even if you say something against the government, it can be treated as promoting disaffection against the state and therefore an unlawful activity. And then there is a very draconian provision for bail, which says that no bail can be granted unless the judge says that there is not even a prima facie case against this accused. Now, even when some totally bogus evidence is sought to be adduced against an accused, or inadmissible evidence is sought to be adduced against an accused, the judge can't give bail. This is the position that has happened, and that is why UAPA is increasingly being misused particularly by the BJP, but by other governments also, to imprison people who are found to be inconvenient or who are saying inconvenient things which are not convenient to the government. So it needs to be struck down. We have challenged the provisions, these draconian provisions of UAPA, and the case is pending in the Supreme Court.
Again, Armed Forces
Special Powers Act
is another anti-people act, and Kashmir, North Indian states are suffering a lot due to this act. And you had a very strong stand against this anti-people law, and while you were in Aam Aadmi Party, even it created controversy when you had a strong stand which was very different on Kashmir, which was very different from others. Now, when you think of even recently, 14 innocent villagers were mercilessly killed by the armed forces. So when you think of in Nagaland, when you think of Armed
Special Powers Act,
so what do you think, or how we can fight against such laws which do not consider any human rights?
No, in my view, that law is also unconstitutional, though unfortunately its constitutionality had been upheld by the Supreme Court. But in my view, there is no rationale whatsoever to grant impunity to the armed forces. I mean, if somebody is killed in a genuine encounter, or even in an encounter which the armed forces personnel could be said to have believed to be a proper genuine encounter, then of course they will not be charged. But where is the question of giving them impunity for outright rape and murder? This is what the Armed Forces Special Powers Act does, and that is why it has led to such enormous human rights violations in those states where it is in force, and where the army has been given virtually a free hand to do whatever they want, whether it's Kashmir or Northeast, etc. So in my view, this needs to be done away with, and public opinion and the pressure of public opinion can only lead to doing away with it. And that is why people need to stand up and speak out against it, that this kind of impunity is not only desirable, but it is counterproductive.
We know that the central government, which is dominated by RSS political ideology, do not encourage even opposition, they do not engage debate and dialogue, and they want to have an authoritarian regime to be ruled in India. And on the other hand, the political parties, political opposition parties, especially Congress, we know that they are not able to work effectively. And even sometimes we find they take soft Hindutva stance, right? So at the same time, there are other small political organizations which still fight against this left political ideology. So, do you think that our democracy as a system which prevails in our world, which we think that's the most progressive system for people's representation, do you think democratic system and institution itself is in a crisis and it's time for us to revive or even to think something different?
No, I think democracy is certainly required, and clearly the present electoral system has shown up a great deal of weaknesses of democracy. One of them is that in the kind of, we have only representative democracy, we don't have any direct democracy at all, which means that we elect our representatives and they then rule us. We need to have some system of initiatives and referendums also, where people can directly say what they want to say.
Exactly.
We don't have any pre-legislative consultation on laws. Today we find laws are being passed in Parliament in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, etc., without any discussion or debate even in Parliament. Of course we need to have debate and discussion in Parliament. Of course these laws, important laws, need to be referred to parliamentary committees where they can be discussed and debated at greater length, at greater leisure. But we also need some pre-legislative consultation with the people, where people can at least have their say on what they feel about a particular law or not. Similarly, you see, our representative democracy system consists of first past the post at two levels, when we elect our representative and then when we form the government, which means that the candidate who gets the largest number of votes, even if he gets 25% only, becomes the sole representative of that constituency, and the other votes of other candidates count for nothing. Then when the government is formed, the party or the coalition which has a majority forms the whole government and the opposition counts for nothing. So this has led to a situation where people do not necessarily vote for their best candidate or their best party that they like, if they feel that that candidate or party has no chance of winning, because they don't want to waste their vote. So they then see which are the parties or candidates who have some chance of winning, and among them vote for the least bad. So in order to change this, we need to have some form of proportional representation. Then we need to do away with the role of money power, because today this perception of which candidates or parties have some chance of winning is mostly on the basis of the visibility of those parties or those candidates. And visibility has become a function of money. And today money rules the roost in elections, and there are some parties, particularly parties in power, who have unlimited money, and opposition has virtually nothing. Therefore, we need to reform the system. We need to have some public funding of elections so that even smaller candidates and smaller parties have access to some money. Secondly, we need to effectively implement the restriction on spending in elections. Today, when Modi said that we are doing Notbandi in order to reduce the role of cash transactions and everything should be through banks, I understand that ordinary people cannot do all transactions through banks, but at least political parties and candidates can be asked to do all transactions through banks. That has not been done. There is no limit on spending by political parties. That needs to be imposed. Because once you impose that, then you have introduced electoral bonds, which is a totally non-transparent way of funding political parties. We must have complete transparency. Political parties must come under RTI so that all their affairs and their accounts are completely transparent. So these are some of the reforms which we need to bring about to make our democracy more effective.
In 21st century, we face multiple issues. So do you think that it's time for us to have a different education system to inculcate the values of cooperation, interdependence, and values of sustainability, equity? So we should have a different education system to bring about a new change in our life.
So to some extent, the new education policy of 2005 sought to do that. The whole object of the Yashpal committee was to provide the kind of education that is required at least in schools. In my view, education should have two objectives. One is to promote the capacity for critical thinking and reasoning, and the second is to become aware of and empathetic to other people, other beings, other communities, etc. So that is what needs to be done. But unfortunately, this government has declared a war on critical thinking, and it is therefore damaging all our higher educational institutions, universities, etc., which are supposed to be the citadels of critical thinking, where issues, policies, etc. are discussed, debated, critiqued, and people form informed opinions about those. So we need to reclaim, firstly, prevent the destruction of our existing educational systems, and reclaim and further improve those educational institutions and systems.
You have been saying that in the beginning onwards, the COVID vaccination was done in India without proper testing and also without adequate studies. So, and also you are representing a case filed by Dr. Jacob Puliel, the former National Technical Advisory Council on Vaccination. So normally people do not stand against modern medicine. It's very surprising to see that you are ready to fight against such an important issue. So what was the drive, or what was the conviction that you had, or the evidences that you had to fight against such a nationally important issue?
So I have been doing a lot of studying and reading about COVID, lockdowns, masks, vaccines, etc. And the studies have shown that that the official policy, which has largely been driven ultimately by two people, Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci, that is a policy of creating fear about COVID, the policy of not allowing or not recommending any safe and effective treatments for COVID other than vaccines, the policy of promoting lockdowns by countries and communities, the policy of making everybody wear masks, and the policy of issuing vaccine mandates, pushing vaccines and issuing vaccine mandates that if you don't take the vaccine, you won't have access to ABCD services, or you won't be able to continue with your job, etc. These policies have been driven ultimately from the top by two people, Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci, and with the help of a large section of the media who have been paid by them or their people, and large social media platforms. And they have virtually censored all alternative opinions on this. 80% of the scientists today engaged in research on this are ultimately paid through funds which are controlled by either Fauci or Bill Gates. The other 20% who are independent and who speak contrary, or who express contrary views about these issues, they are censored. Their views are not allowed to be published, their views are not allowed to be seen. And I have taken the trouble of reading all these things, and the data and the science is now pretty clear, and it is clear that COVID is not a disease to be feared so much, especially by the young and the healthy people. It hardly has any impact on them. It is only the old or the very vulnerable people who get impacted by COVID. Secondly, there are effective treatments available, safe, effective and cheap. Vitamin D, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, etc., which can be easily given, which reduces morbidity and mortality very substantially. Thirdly, that once you've had COVID, and serological surveys show that 90% of India has had COVID, then you are protected much better than the vaccine protection. Fourthly, that vaccines do not stop you from getting the infection or even spreading the infection. At best, they will stop serious infection or death. Now, if you have already had COVID or if you are young and healthy, then the chances of you are having serious COVID are very, very, very small. And therefore, you have to weigh whether you are getting the vaccine, even if it is protecting you to some extent against getting serious disease, whether that is worth the risk of adverse effects of the vaccine. Now, unfortunately, that debate is not being allowed to happen because there is such censorship of alternative views. And since I have had taken the trouble to study all that, there is a book written by Robert Kennedy Jr., who is a lawyer, very respected lawyer in America, who runs an organization called Children's Health Defense. He wrote a book published recently called The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma and the War on Democracy and Public Health. That book has more than 3,000 references of government data and papers published by very respectable scientists in very respectable scientific journals. Everything that he says in that is fully referenced. Anybody who reads that book will come to know what the real truth is. Unfortunately, you see, there are so many vested interests that have been now created at the top. Politicians also have a vested interest because they use lockdowns and the fear of COVID as an instrument of control. Lockdown and all these kind of mandates are an instrument of control. Freedom of choice, the freedom to go about your life normally, all that is being taken away. So therefore, it's a very, very serious problem, and that is why I have been speaking a lot about it.
So last time when you came to Kerala, you participated in a people's rally, fishermen's rally in Pundura. So we know that in Kerala, it's another Vizhinjam project is another destructive project.
Yeah.
So it's a open space for Adani to loot the natural resources and to make money, as it happens throughout the world. So do you think that Kerala government also gave another opportunity for a corporate company to loot our state?
Yes, unfortunately, the Vizhinjam project is, to my mind, again a very ecologically destructive, financially also destructive project, because it will cause a lot of damage to the coastal ecology and to the local fishermen there. It is also not required because you don't need another international port. Kerala already has a couple of international ports, and there are several international ports in the southern region. Therefore, it was totally not required. And at such a huge cost, it's just destroying the coastline of that region, as it is causing huge erosion of the coast, and the coast has come inwards. So therefore, again, it is being allowed to go on for vested corporate interests. I mean, unfortunately, these big corporations like Adani, Ambani, etc., have the ability to compromise politicians and governments of all hues, of all parties. We have seen that happening again and again.
I'm surprised to see you that you are spending 3 days in Kerala, and this is the second time you are visiting recently, and you have lots of work here to fight important cases in Supreme Court. So how you manage time and take care of health, and it's something very surprising to see you moving around and being with people, understanding them, supporting them. So what's the drive behind that?
So fortunately, this is our winter vacation time, so I could come. It's not always easy to come. I can only come when the courts are closed. But I feel that because my voice is heard in Kerala by the people, by the media, for whatever reason, that whatever help I can give by way of stopping the destruction of Kerala, by way of helping positive people's movements, I should do that, and that's why I come.
Mr. Prashanth Bhushan, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.